Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining me today. My name is Rose Judge. I'm an open source engineer at VMware, and today I'm going to talk to you about how you can improve your Git commits in 2 easy steps. So who am I? As I mentioned, I'm an open source engineer at VMware, and part of my role there is to co-maintain an open source project called Turn. Turn is a container analysis tool written in Python that generates a software bill of materials for container images. The project originated at VMware with only one developer, my colleague Nisha Kumar, and has since grown to have 2 maintainers and a small community of regular contributors. So when we as maintainers and also we as contributors, right, we're contributors to our own project and maybe other projects as well. When we think of Git commits, I think that this cartoon might be what a lot of us think about. And while commits like this comic here may work in a personal repository or a private project, we want to try to avoid a changelog that looks like this for open source projects where we're trying to grow the project and the contributor base. And if you're looking at this comic like, ooh, I think parts of my changelog might look like this. That's okay. I don't want you to panic. This is not a talk designed to shame anyone. Instead, I'm going to focus today on how we can write better commits and how we can guide our contributors to also write better commits and why it benefits the project to do so. So when you're reviewing a pull request, what do you look for in a commit? What makes it good enough to merge? I would like to offer 2 simple criteria here that you can keep in your back pocket to make sure that the commits for your project are excellent. The first is that each commit only does one thing, and the second is that each commit message should be its own self-contained story. So what exactly do I mean when I say each commit must only do one thing? How do we determine what that one thing is? And how do we encourage other contributors to do the same? So at a high level, I want you to think of a commit like a recipe. If I were to show you this picture of a carrot cake and say, here are all the ingredients, I want you to go make this cake, would you know where to start without a recipe? Probably not, right? So think of a pull request, which is made up of 1 or more commits as the cake. And by breaking up each commit to only do one thing, you make your recipe easy to understand. So for example, one step in your pull request, quote unquote, recipe might be move function A from file A to file B, or remove function X, etc. I don't know if you've ever tried to follow a recipe where all the directions are crammed into one giant step, but if you have, you know how hard that can be to follow along. And the same goes for your changelog. If you're trying to cram all of your changes into one large commit, it's going to be confusing to understand what's happening there. Not to mention, if you encounter an issue in your code, your changelog is a list of steps that you can trace back to find where the problem was introduced. If you want to sift through your changelog to try to find a buggy commit, it's going to be much harder to do this when you're looking at giant commits versus smaller commits that each do one clear thing. But enough about cake. How do we start to break up our changes? So let's assume you have all your changes ready to go. You know, you've implemented the feature, you fixed the bug or whatever, and you're ready to open that pull request. When you start to break up your commits, think of writing that recipe. Each step, each commit does one thing, and all the steps put together tell a story of how to make your cake. And looking at this list, I don't want you to worry about memorizing it or anything. These points are not step-by-step requirements in any particular order. They're all meant to be very high level. So when you go about breaking up your commits or suggesting to contributors how they might break up their commits, you might start by isolating the non-functional changes. Maybe you're updating documentation, or maybe you're copying and pasting code from one file to another. Those would both qualify as non-functional commits, right? Things where no code is actually changing can be its own commit. And you might have several of these types of commits in a pull request. Next, you could look at your functional changes. So maybe you're adding a new function. That new function definition might be one commit, or you're renaming a function, maybe changing the name of the function throughout the code, even if it touches 10 files, is going to be another commit because it's just doing one thing. Another example might be if you're making changes to an API, and let's say that you're adding a function parameter. Instead of adding the parameter and changing all the code around it at the same time, your first commit might add the new parameter, and then the next commit might actually build the functionality around it. The third one here, if any part of your changes are related to code cleanup, each cleanup step should get its own commit. So oftentimes code cleanup will occur in parallel with new functionality or new features, but the cleanup itself should still be a separate commit from the feature implementation. And then my last note on this is breaking up your commits is that none of them should break the build, which just means that at each commit, the code should compile. So once you've separated out your commits so that each is only doing one thing, so using some of the criteria that I just discussed, the second step to improving your Git commits is writing an informative Git commit message. And there are lots of stylistic choices that you can make here that we won't have time to get into. But regardless of those style choices, you want to make sure each commit is its own self-contained story. So what type of information specifically should your commit message contain? When you write or you're reviewing a commit message, generally speaking, a good question to ask yourself is there enough context here to make sense of what's happening if someone looking at this had never seen the code? I think sometimes when we're writing commit messages, we think, well, I wrote this commit, like if anyone has questions, they'll just come and ask me. But this is not particularly practical in open source, especially when you're working across numerous time zones, and providing enough context for your changes is really crucial. So when you start writing your commit message, first, summarize what changed in the subject line of your commit. This should be descriptive enough that someone reading it would have a general idea of what the commit is doing. And then the body of your commit message will be your explanation of why and in what context you're making the change. In order to help capture all the relevant information, you might also include links to relevant outside references like a related discussion on a mailing list or a forum. You might add a reference to a GitHub issue or links to a ticket or bug report. And if you're including any type of URL or link, it's important that enough context exists in the commit message itself that the reader doesn't have to click on the link to understand your changes. Right? If you do include a link, it should be used as supportive evidence in addition to the summary of the relevant information. And there's a few reasons for this. One, the person reading your commit message might not have the time to follow a bunch of links. And two, the link might not exist forever. It is the internet after all. So your description should still make sense on its own without having to click on the link. If your commit is related to a bug fix, be sure to include any error messages in your code that the commit might be fixing. And this can be helpful later down the line if someone hits that same error message and tries to search the changelog for a fix. And then lastly, I put nice to have mention how you arrived at your change. And I added this because if you spend a bunch of time working on your change and maybe you tried a few iterations of your implementation before you arrived at your the final commit, it's just worth noting that in the changelog so that if someone else in the future goes to look at it, they can know what you did and not have to redo any work around it. So a good commit message boils down to a good story. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and all the relevant details are clearly summarized in context. And when I say self-contained, what I mean is to make sure that you're explaining any assumptions related to future or past commits in your commit message. So as an example, I've seen a series of commits where the first one says something like, see you next patch for more information. And the trouble with that phrasing is that the next patch may not be what you think it is when it eventually gets merged into the project. So instead of saying that, you could say, oops, sorry. Instead of saying that, you could say, in order to enable X future functionality, we first have to add Y function in this commit or something like that. Okay, so I've unpacked a lot of information in the last 9 minutes about how to break up your commits and how to write a good commit message. And you might be thinking, well, I understand why this is required for a project like the kernel or Kubernetes, where there's thousands of contributors, but I maintain an open source project with 2 contributors or no contributors. And do I really need to do this? So I, of course, am going to say yes. Good commits that follow these 2 principles of each commit does one thing and each commit message is its own self-contained story are paramount to the sustained success of any project. More specifically, good commits enable support for a downstream stable version of the project. So the kernel is a great example of this. Let's say you have a stable branch and you only want to pull certain features from it. If your code is broken up into small commits, it's much easier to do that. If you're working with larger commits, you're going to have to pull in a bunch of additional code that you'll then have to maintain. Good commits also make future debugging easier. So if you encounter a regression in the future and you need to figure out which change caused the problem, working with smaller commits that only do one thing make it possible to find the exact point in time where something went wrong. If your commits are each doing 10 things, there's no easy way to test which of those 10 things broke the build. But if you have smaller commits, testing these individually can help isolate the problem. And then in any long-running project, there will come a time when code cleanup is required, and good commits help facilitate this cleanup. So for example, if you write in your commit message, this change was made to support X feature, and a year from now, you deprecate feature X, then you know you can safely remove that commit that said that it was for feature X. So in this way, good commit messages help keep your code lean and maintainable. Good commits are also a really easy insurance policy against attrition in your project. So if anybody contributing to your project suddenly leaves the community or leaves the company, and doesn't have time to work on it anymore, or wins the lottery and decides they're never going to write another line of code again, good commits make it possible for the project to continue even when the contributor is not around to ask questions to. Good commits facilitate working with folks in different time zones, especially with COVID. Like, this has become really important, right? Instead of having to ask someone to explain their changes, you can just refer to the commit, which should contain all the information you need to understand it. And then lastly, you can think of good commit messages for your project like you would good documentation for your project, in that if they're detailed and organized, new contributors are able to look into a project, get an idea of what's going on, and jump right in getting started without having to ask someone. So if at any point in this presentation you've thought to yourself, okay, I can see why good, structured, detailed commits are useful, and maybe we have a little bit of room to improve, right? Let's be honest, we all do. How can you start to put these changes into practice for the project you maintain? And it's really as simple as just starting today. Even if your project is a year old and you maybe haven't focused on commits in the past, start right now. Breaking up your commits so they only do one thing, and then writing that detailed commit message for it. And then also encouraging your contributors to do the same. So to help with this, put your commit requirements and expectations in your project documentation. And if you're a contributor to a project that doesn't have these expectations laid out, open a bug and encourage the project maintainers to write their expectations down. Especially if you're a maintainer for a project, having your commit requirements laid out will save you time when you get a new contributor to your project who opens a pull request with a bad commit. Instead of having to seem biased or giving a long-winded explanation all the time, you have something concrete that you can point to and say, please revise your commit in accordance with these standards. And when you are writing your own code, lead by example. Write the commit message that you want to read a year from now. Break up your commits in such a way that if you had to debug a patch that well into the future, it would be a pleasant experience. And finally, as a maintainer and a leader of a project, it's important to hold others accountable for their work, for their commits. And this can be hard when you have a really productive contributor that writes amazing code and you totally appreciate everything they contribute, but they write maybe sloppy commit messages. Sometimes the last thing you want to say is, please go fix your commits, and I really can't merge this until you do. Especially if you're working towards a milestone or it's like a really crucial bug fix. And it's tempting to just say, forget it, we'll worry about it next time. But know that holding others accountable for their work creates a culture of continuous improvement, which makes your project and the engineers who work on it better. So thank you all for your time today, and please reach out with any questions.